visiting the Dishes Mitigation Section webinar archive. The webinar you are about to view was created by Dishes and presented live for a prior FEMA mitigation grant cycle. It has been edited to include content that remains relevant to current FEMA mitigation grants. However, you may hear information regarding prior grants being discussed during the question and answer portion. Specific grants mentioned during the webinar are no longer open for applications, but there may be current grant opportunities available. For information on currently available grants, or if you have questions about mitigation in general, please contact Dishes Mitigation at the email address listed. New funding is made available annually, and each time there is a major FEMA disaster declared within the state. Thank you for your interest in mitigation, and we hope you find the following webinar helpful.
The first thing I'll be going over is just adding the Excel add-in into your client so that you can access the BCA toolkit. Next slide, please. First thing I'll go over is just some simple concepts. Now, to evaluate proposed hazard mitigation projects prior to funding, FEMA requires a benefit cost analysis, BCA, to validate cost effectiveness. The project's total net benefits divided by its total project cost is called the benefit cost ratio, BCR. Now, if the BCR is 1.0 or greater, the project is considered cost effective. Now, to ensure that the project is cost effective, applicant and sub-applicant must use FEMA approved methodologies and the supplemental guidance for the BCA toolkit, the version 6.0. Next slide, please. Now, the first step is just going to the FEMA.gov website to download the BCA Toolkit Excel template. You can either just Google it, or we will also provide the link in the slides later on. When you click on that link and get onto that website, you scroll down a little bit under Benefit Cost Analysis Toolkit, and the box outlined in red with the little arrow next to it, you will click on that button, and that will download the Excel template file for you. Next slide, please. Once you have the Excel file open, the next step will be just going into the Insert tab right next to the Home tab on the top of the screen. Next slide, please, Alicia. After you click on the Insert tab, you will go under the Add-in section. You will click on that Get Add-ins button. Once you do so, you'll be able to access the Microsoft Office store. Next slide, please. Once you see the Microsoft Office Store screen pop up, you will type in BCA into the search bar, click search, enter, or that little magnifying box right next to it, and that will show you the FEMA benefit cost analysis calculator with the green add button next to it. You will need to click on that green add button to add that into your Excel client. Next slide, please. Once you do so, it will ask if you agree to the license terms and privacy policy. If you do agree, please click continue. Next slide, please. Once you do that, if you have done so successfully, you'll see that green excerpt pop up on your screen with the FEMA BCA version 6.0 icon on the top right-hand corner of your screen. So that shows that it was successfully added. Next slide, please. Starting the analysis for the BCA toolkit. Next slide, please. Now, the initial steps, once you do have that Excel add-in into your client, you will go ahead and click on that icon, the FEMA BCA v6.0. Once you do that, a little screen right below it will pop up, and that will say FEMA BCA calculator. It'll have a blue open calculator button on it. Once you click that, that will launch the BCA software module for you. It'll open up in a new page. And then once you see that screen on the bottom left of the slideshow, you'll see plus add project on the top of that module. Once you click that, you'll be able to start entering in your project details, project configuration, etc. Next slide, please. Now, one thing I definitely want to go over is the help button. It's the lowercase I icon that's pointed out in the top right. That's a great resource to view any standard values accepted by FEMA and also to define any of the terms being used in the toolkit. Now, the toolkit also does a lot of auto population for you. So there will be default values all over the toolkit. And if you needed to enter in a custom value, you can switch the toggle to no. So if you see that red box right next to use default question mark, if you clicked on that, it'll toggle to no, and then you would be able to enter in your own custom value for, in this case, the number of maintenance years. If you are going with a custom value, please be sure to always provide a comment and documentation when not using the default. Next slide, please. Now, some of the items listed in the project configuration, we'll start with project title, that you have to input the same title as used in the sub application for the project. Right below that is property location. It is important to use the most accurate project address and or GPS coordinates, latitude/longitude. Property structure type, that's going to be a drop-down selection for critical facility buildings, utility, roads, and bridges, and other. Below that is hazard type. That's going to be a drop-down selection for the primary hazard being mitigated, whether it's a riverine flood, severe storm, etc., hurricane wind. And then below that is a mitigation action type dropdown. Now this dropdown selection relates best to the proposed scope. So depending on the project, whether it's elevation, acquisition, relocation, you would select that. Next slide, please. Damage and frequency relationship. So now there's 3 relationships you can select: model damages, historical damages, or professional expected damages. Model damages, you will select this option to perform the analysis on the property regardless of past damage history. The BCA results for the selected hazard will be modeled based on the inputs provided. Please note that model damages are not available for generators, unfortunately. Below that, historical damages, you can select this option if historic damages and losses and the dates, years are available. Sources of documentation for historic damages include, but are not limited to, utility power outage report, insurance claims, damage repair records, data from state local agencies, newspaper citing, and FEMA project worksheets. And then for professional expected damages, you can select this option if the scientific data would show how much damage would result if a given event were to occur. Documentation could include engineering reports, technical studies, etc. Documentation must be provided for all damages. So if you do have the engineering reports, technical studies, you can go that route for a generator project. The example that I will be demonstrating later in this webinar, we will be doing historical damages. Next slide, please. Damage frequency assessment. The 3 inputs for this section is year of analysis conducted. That's just typically the current calendar year, so it would be 2022 currently. Year property was built. That's when the asset being mitigated was built. So it could, whatever the year of the building or bridge was constructed. And then the analysis duration, that's just calculated by subtracting the above inputs. Next slide, please. Setting up a general generator project benefit cost analysis. Next slide, please. Now we'll go chronologically in the beginning. First section is going to be the project configuration section. You enter in your project title, you enter in your project location, you can enter the address or the latitude, longitudes. Next slide, please. Then next up is property structure type. Now, generator projects are eligible for critical facility buildings, so you would select that. And then the next step is where it gets slightly tricky. Now, chronologically, you would think that the next step is selecting the hazard type. But the hazard type that needs to be selected for a generator project can be an infrastructure failure, uncategorized. And those hazard types will not be available when you click on the dropdown. And the reason for that is because by default, the BCA toolkit will have model damages selected. And as I mentioned in the earlier slides, model damages are not available for generator projects. So what you would need to do is first click on the correct damage and frequency relationship, which would be historical damages or professional expected damages. In this case, we went with historical damages because we had a lot of historic data available. Next slide, please. Now, once you have historical or professional expected damages selected, now when you go into the hazard type and try to click the correct hazard type, you will be able to see you can select infrastructure failure. We are using that mitigation action in this scenario because it will be mitigating power loss. Next slide, please. Now, once you go to mitigation action type, the only one that will be available is other. So you select that. So those are the three inputs you should be seeing: critical facility building, infrastructure failure, other. You have historical damages selected. Once that is all good, you can go on to the next section, which will be the cost estimation right below it. So next slide, please. Now for the cost estimation section, the first input will be project useful life. The BCA help content, the little lowercase I button, that lists the standard value for useful life for different mitigation projects. For generators, the standard useful life is 19 years. So once you click that lowercase I button, it will open up the FEMA pull table, project useful life. If you scroll down to generators and miscellaneous equipment, right next to it, you'll see 19 years as the standard value. If you wanted to enter a value different than 19 years, you would just have to provide some supporting documentation. That can be the manufacturer's warranty or specifications, etc. Next slide, please. So that's what the pull table would look like once you click the lowercase I button. And right next to generators is 19 years. Next slide, please. The next input will be initial project cost. So whatever you input on the sub application, that's what you would be inputting here. Next slide, please. Now the project cost input to the BCA should match the cost estimate in the application. The cost estimate should include, at a minimum, the cost of the generator, the cost of the transfer switch, wiring and installation costs, design engineering costs, permitting, and any project management or administrative costs. And we have an example right there for that. Next slide, please. Number of maintenance years will be auto-populated based on the project useful life. And then right below that, it will ask you to enter in the annual maintenance costs. Now, annual maintenance costs are those costs necessary for the upkeep or repair of mitigation project components so that the project maintains its originally designed and approved level of effectiveness. For a generator project, maintenance costs should include labor costs, any replacement costs such as oil and filters, and costs for a system check. Estimates can be provided by a manufacturer's recommendation, standard cost estimating software, maintenance documentation from a similar generator used in a nearby location, or documentation from a reliable source such as a professional with relevant expertise. Next slide, please. Once you have all those inputs selected, you can go ahead and click on the next button right below, and that's going to take you to the second page of the BCA toolkit. Next slide, please. Alicia, next slide, please. Now, this section on the second page, you'll see damage analysis parameters first. The only field you really have to input here is the year the asset being mitigated was built. So for this case, we have 1984. And next slide, please. Right below that will be critical facility properties. So here you will select the critical facility type that you will be putting this generator in, if it's a police station, hospital, fire station, or other. Now, if you do select police station, hospital, or fire station, there will be corresponding questions that will be listed there, such as how many people are served by this police station, where is the closest police station if this were to go out of service, how far is it, similar to hospital, how many people are served by this hospital, etc. But if you go ahead and select the other option, then for other facilities, the only question it will really be asking you is the annual operating budget for that facility. So we'll go ahead and input that. Next slide, please. Historical damages before mitigation. Now, for historic damages before mitigation, you will need to enter a row for every damage event. To add rows, click the plus add row button outlined in yellow. Now, for each damage event, enter the year of the event and the loss of function that occurred due to the event. Acceptable documentation for damages before mitigation must show the date the power loss event occurred and the duration of loss of function. If power loss duration is provided in hours or minutes, you can convert that into days and enter it into the BCA. It is also helpful to include the cause of the power loss if known. Next slide, please. Here is an example of an acceptable document that can be used to determine the amount of time a facility experienced a power outage. It's time-stamped and the duration in minutes can be converted into days, and those days can be input into the BCA calculator as impact days. So as you can see on the left-hand side, it's an official letter from Con Edison. It's a power outage report. It states the premise, the address of the location, and when the power went offline and when it came back online and how many minutes it was offline for an entire. Now, the three bottom rows of that table, you see there's three different dates for 2012 for Hurricane Sandy, 5,214 minutes, 60 minutes, 53 minutes. You can add those figures up because they're all in 2012. Convert that into days, and then you would be able to put that in as impact days for 2012. Next slide, please. BCA additional resources. Next slide, please. So here we put together some additional resources to give a bit more information if you wanted to read up on the BCA toolkit or see how it works, training materials, etc. Next slide, please. BCA recurrence interval resources. These are also some national databases that can help you with data for a specific location. For example, the first one that says Advanced Technology Council data for hurricane wind speed and seismic data by location. So by clicking on that link and entering in the latitude, longitude coordinates, the website will tell you what the wind speed and the seismic data and what the recurrence intervals would be for if you were doing a wind retrofit project, for example. These are some of the resources you can utilize. Next slide, please. Technical assistance. Now, Dishes has an application development team available and ready to provide technical assistance with application development, assistance with the benefit cost analysis, and assistance to applicants who are not familiar with the FEMA HMGP process. So at this point, I would like to thank you for your time and definitely wanted to leave a lot of time open for questions. So we will now be taking any questions that you may have.
Perfect, Prab. I do have two in the question in the Q&A box that I haven't had an answer yet for, or haven't answered yet for, I should say. The first question is, what happens if you don't know the year the road or a dam was built?
If you're not exactly sure what year the road or the dam was built, if there aren't any historical records, maybe if it's like over 100 years old or something of that nature, it is possible you can use the default value. It'll just be an analysis duration of about 10 years, I believe. But the more information you can provide, the better for a FEMA review.
Perfect. And I'm going to ask Alicia if you can pull Mark Diaz up into the panel. Perfect. Mark, is there anything else that you would like to add to that question? I'm not sure if you were able to hear it or if you were in the middle of...
No, I'm here. Hi team. This is Mark Diaz. So All right, so for the year built for any structure, the rule of thumb is look for your own internal documentation you may have, again, blueprints, construction documents, or similar. In the case that you can't find it, you may want to consider having a local Department of Public Works or whoever owns the facility give a statement to at least provide the year built, and that's at least an initial data point to at least move forward until further data can be found. We may be able to research and see if maybe there is prior environmental studies that may, for those that are historical properties, that would offer the year built, but again, we're limited in even what we can find. So that's very much on the ground data. We would ask you to take all your resources to find that if you can, but to Prab's point, he's correct. If one is not known, the year built is left blank, you will use what is known as an analysis duration of 10 years, just as that you're using minimum confidence in your calculations. So it would technically, it would technically be acceptable, but again, we want to make sure we use all the data we can find on your project. So anything involving the year built, especially with generators or any other project, we really do ask you to find any material and information you can provide. And if it results in a newer letter being issued and, signed and dated from the town, village, or city, or agency, obviously, as well, we ask you to do so.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. We also have how many years back can or should an applicant go when calculating power outages?
All right, that's a good question. The rule of thumb is, as long as it's documentable, right? So if you are able to show, let's say, okay, compared to now, let's say 42 years ago was 1980. If you have 1980 outages and they're documented either newspaper-wise or your utility company can provide the letter as shown as in today's webinar, then that is fine. If you have a limit on how far you can document, then that's literally your historical record. It may only go back maybe 20 years. We don't want to claim, say, 1980 and 1990 outages without further proof and documentation. So I would again tell everybody to review your internal records, see what's available, and obviously coordinate with your utility companies to provide a letter similar to what's shown here. And again, keyword, they must be able to document it or at least attest to it, which is more important because they're going to be signing this letter.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's see what else. Would a solar panel be an acceptable alternate power source? So that, again, everything comes down to showing your cost effectiveness. This potentially could be an eligible project. We definitely encourage you to reach out to the HMGP 4480 at dishes.ny.gov email so we can have a larger conversation about that. But with our projects, the important thing to keep in mind is that it does have to be cost effective, right? We want to show that the project that we're doing, the benefits of those projects are outweighing the cost. And there was another question about how this pertains to COVID. So if you take the term COVID out of this, this is a traditional hazard mitigation grant program. The funding source for any HMGP program comes from the disaster declaration. That's the DR that you see in front of that number. The declaration, the presidential declaration that this funding source is through the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you take that COVID-19 out, it is that traditional hazard mitigation grant program where we're looking to help protect against that critical infrastructure through sustainability and reducing risk. Let's see. There are some additional questions. Are there questions in regard to, while we have the BCA team, we can do the hand raise. I can answer the questions in the box, but do you have any questions pertaining to BCA or specific generator benefit cost questions? You can go ahead. Alicia, are you able to unmute Natalie Keikel? My apologies if I pronounced your last name incorrect.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
This is Natalie from the City of Kingston. I'm the grants manager. And
Hi.
hi, thanks for answering my questions. I just started here a few days ago, actually, and I'm working with somebody else on the application. So I may be asking a question that she already knows the answer to. But one of the questions is, I just watched the previous webinar right before this one, the one that was recorded, and I believe that it was said that project management was not included. We were not able to include that in the budget, but I believe in this webinar, it was just said that we can. So I guess this is more just like an application question. Can we
Sure.
include
So what do you
project
mean by
management
project,
costs?
the management costs? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I guess I'm just asking what would be an acceptable item to include in terms of either project management or grant management or administrative overhead type fee.
Hi, Beth. I think I know what happened, and Natalie, please let me know. If it's management costs, it's the application. If it's the maintenance cost, that's the BCA consideration. But that's included for BCA, right? To say that the project needs the upkeep and repair, and that's documented separately. But then there's a management cost included, and I'll have Beth clarifying that. But Natalie, does that make sense so far? There's two costs going on. One is application side and one is BCA side.
Yes, so the maintenance cost is included in the BCA, but in terms of the application, we can include a management cost.
Usually it's documented separately. It wouldn't be rolled into the quote unquote submitted budget. So say, roughly speaking, your project is worth, I'm going to just ballpark this, say $100,000. That $100,000 should be everything, and the maintenance costs, let's say on that project, is $5,000. That amount is documented and explained separately, because it'll be documented for the BCA, but it's a separate item altogether. And then it has to have the premise that again, the town, city, or village is willing to take on the maintenance program itself for the project after it's completed.
Okay, thank you. And can we go back to slide 33? There was a question I had there.
Alicia, are we able to go back up in the slides?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so can you just go over some of those other columns? For example, the volunteer costs, what we would input there?
Okay, Beth, I'll take this one. Prab,
Okay.
if you can join in, just let me know. Okay, so the optional damages column is for typical damages that are not already accounted for by the toolkit, right? So, for example, in the data chart on screen, there was impact days. There's a calculation in the that goes before it to say what the cost is for a utility per day, which is done by the toolkit, and you multiply by the days for the total damages. That's how, for example, with 3 days, you're showing $61,000 in damages, at least in this example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're to say that because of the generator, additional damages were incurred, literally physical other damages, you can rename category 1 to say, additional repairs or, required, or however, whatever it makes sense in what happened in the event. You'll change the name of that category 1 to say, let's say repairs. That amount needs to be invoiced or documented, and you'll put in that number, and it'll add to the damages column on the far right. In terms of volunteers, it's a very limited case. It's for projects that have volunteer need. You're saying that you no longer have those expenses incurred after this project. So, for example, there's things about sandbagging, or if you have a flood, flood damage furnishings, and you had volunteers paid to remove those carpets, general office furniture or similar, that would be that cost category. And again, when you go into the toolkit, or whoever will be going to the toolkit, or obviously we'll work on technical assistance, there's guidance on exact examples for these and what documentation to include to help,
Okay.
evaluate. Would that apply to us?
Great, thank
and
you.
also, absolutely. So team, just for everybody on the call, just always view it as, does this apply to me? And if you need to check that, you use the icon, which Prab mentioned, and a lot of the FEMA guidance is provided at paragraphs at a time to explain what the concept is, and usually the examples included. Now, we know the examples are limited. There's usually only 2 or 3. You may say, well, I don't fit that example. Then definitely provide us that information, and we'll look to see if it should be included or not. And we'll reach out, to our own experts to make sure that this makes sense. And obviously, team, you should, also know the BCA helpline is the other resource other than dishes, because they could have a way in to say, if that would make sense relative to how you want to document it and explain it, but the only trade-off with the helpline, they cannot say it's acceptable, because that lays on dishes side. But at least you want to say, how can we write up this damage? That's a good helpline question, and you want to say that, is this a fair way to account for it?
Great, thanks, Mark. We do have another question that I think is a good one for everybody to hear is, if I know that a road washed out 5 times in the past, but only have costs documented for 2, do I show all the BCA or only the ones I have documents for? So I think that's a very good question, because I think a lot of us are probably in similar situations where we know past damages or past occurrences have happened, but we don't necessarily have the documentation for that. Mark or Prab, do you have suggestions on the best practice for that?
One thing I would like to say.
Do I go first?
Yeah, I think I'll go first, and then anything I miss, Mark, you can definitely take over that. If you do not have any documentation, I think that we can definitely include it in the narrative, but including it in the BCA, it is necessary to have documentation to prove it. So if you don't have the cost documents necessary, maybe we can cross that with flood events during that time frame. If you have the dates, anything like that can get provided, we can look up if there were any storms and try to use that as documentation and newspaper sightings, things like that, to show that that's accurate. Anything else you'd like to add, Mark?
Yeah, Prab gives some good information, right? So if for the 2 events that are fully documented at, invoice and letter level, great, we go forward with those. For the 3 that are, occurred, but you don't have enough information yet, use newspaper clippings. Or if you want to say there's a trend, right, but you have to be careful using statistics here. You could say, if, the event caused for 1 day $20,000 of damage, and we just noticed the next event for 2 days cost $40,000 of damage, you could follow that trend, but we just have to be very careful doing that, because at the end of time, you really have to have all 5 events documented. So you could do a statistical argument to say, well, on average, 1 day of impact from each of these events is worth this much money, and then what the actual impact days are from the other sources, we can correlate the 2, but then the trade-off is a statistical argument. That may work to get us at least closer to figure out where your BCA is and if it's still cost-effective. But for FEMA's sake, we want to always say that we documented every input, and that's something to really consider. That if you do 2 events, it still might provide a cost-effective project, but we always encourage more events, whenever possible and whenever relevant. But just, we'll work through again what you provide, and we may be able to fill in the gap. But to everybody's sake, that question I would also pose, if you can, to the BCA helpline and see how they would take that. But it's tough, because we always take the assumption that everything is being documented as much as possible.
Right, perfect. Thanks, Mark. Another question. We have some great questions coming in. If we had to close during a power outage, can we include the cost of staff during that time as damages? I would assume that would fall sort of under a loss of function type aspect. would assume, Mark or Prab. Are you able to utilize loss of staff time there towards a BCA?
All right, Prab, would you like to go first or me on this one?
Yeah, I'll go first, and you can add on. I mean, in terms of that, I think it goes case by case. I personally have not seen that being input in a generator project previously, but depending on what the facility is and the context to that project, I think that would definitely help the case. But I haven't seen it personally.
Right, and to add to Prav's point, if we could find that it is basically, it fits within the project, right? Only in that particular case, again, it's always case by case, we could tabulate the loss of function value per year and add that to the optional damages column. But again, only if it applies and only if it makes sense by the project context. Otherwise, we wouldn't really know. And we don't want to apply it just to all generators because it will vary. Usually it's not, because generators are more physically based, and loss of function comes from other utility projects more often, and that's why when you do generators, you view the electrical service, and that is your loss of function. That's why the impact days are being tracked, because they're saying what the value of the utility loss is. Now, if it's for the staffing, it has to make sense relative to absolute the absolute requirement of staff to keep the function going for that building or facility. So we'll look into hopefully a narrative for that, and we can evaluate it and say, yes, this would work. And then we could do, you can have the calculation showing what the associated loss of function is by staff hours and rates and costs.
Perfect, thank you. We also have a question about how do you calculate damages on such as a road closure? Is it just the repair costs, or is it non-tangible cost of not being able to use the road?
Probably I'll go first, and then Mark can add on. For a road closure, I mean, it's the toolkit's going to ask you specific questions for that. For example, it'll ask you what the average traffic data is for that road, how many trips are being made, if that road was closed, what would the detour route be, how many additional miles it would take, how many additional minutes it would take. So the BCA toolkit will calculate all of that into the benefits of it. So if you had that, that's helpful. Also, if you did have a road closure and you had to, let's say, hire additional staff to monitor the traffic, and if you have those documents, those can be some additional costs that we can incorporate for a road closure project, anything of that nature. And anything else you'd like to add to that, Mark?
No, Prab, you got it right on the nail. That's exactly it, team. So, yeah, and the other thing we ask is when you have road projects and that you are sure of your, we would say the standard route, which is the everyday, versus the detour, which is obviously the storm event did not let people use the usual road. They are taking their alternate. We always ask that you can provide a map, whether it be Google Maps, Google Earth, to show those two routes relative to each other on a map. So that way we know and can confirm that, let's say, the detour adds 0.5 miles to the entire trip plus 10 minutes of additional time, as an example, so we can verify it. Because again, we're always going by context. We do not live in your towns and villages, so we want to make sure that if we're mapping this benefit, it has to be as accurate as possible. We do not want to have a shortfall there. Detour benefits add up very well for projects. It's not a guarantee for a pass, but it does add up very well, as long as you have it properly documented.
Okay, and then there's a follow-up question on that as well. If you're a highway department and you repaired the road with your own crew, how do you calculate and document the damage? So I can kind of touch on this one a little bit. If your own highway departments are the one that's doing the work, that is still an eligible backup documentation. You would be able to show the hours that were worked, the equipment that was done, even the equipment that you have, it's still, there's an hourly rate associated with that, as well as any materials that the community used. You would be able to aggregate that information and provide that as part of the backup documentation. Am I speaking out of turn, Mark or Prab, with that?
Beth, I'm in agreement, but I'll let Prab weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. I'm also in agreement with
Okay.
exactly.
And then we have as well, as far as documentation, is a letter or signed document stating cost damage from a resident be sufficient? I'm going to say it's a good backup, but it's probably not sufficient enough if that resident has claims against, an NFIP or, claims against their insurance. That would be a stronger backup documentation. Definitely, a letter stating is a good start, but I would say you will need something a little more official. Mark, Prab?
Yeah, to jump off Beth's point, same idea, team. Like, what we always want to say is things are documented because, to attest to the damage is one thing to say the estimated damages were $6,000, in one part of the narrative that, and that happens very often. It's more important to eventually see that invoice that shows, okay, instead of approximately, it's $5,000, $934.18. That's much more of a solid lead, and proof of that damage. But in the case that you can't get to that invoice for repair and damages on site, then maybe the homeowner could literally state to some point that they may be issued a check to pay for those repairs, and then they provide a top cover letter saying, yeah, we had damages on this date, and we paid, so-and-so vendor for repairing the damages in the basement due to the incoming water, and they can basically be your documentation, and obviously the check issue shows they paid a vendor for the actual work. Now, the only thing you would have to know is if the vendor is available for further questions, if it were to go from FEMA, to say, well, did this work actually happen? And this can lead to the same question of, can the vendor provide the invoice? So it's a balance. You have to know that what you have on site, what do you know, and what can be documented. If it falls short, letters of attestation, which is what this all fits into, are a nice way to fill the gap, but it's only filling the gap. There is going to eventually be further questions, especially if the project moves forward to FEMA's review, they're going to ask the same questions. So we're trying to get ahead of that by having all your teams figure that out early. Like, do I have this, and can I have it documented now?
Great, thank you. This is another great question, and we haven't really touched on it, so thank you for bringing this up. It's about the pre-calculated analysis for the hospital generators. Do hospitals need to complete the BCA for a generator project? I think this is a good question to kind of clarify the fuzziness about pre-calculated benefits with hospitals.
All right, so I'll go first, and I'll have Prab clarify if we need. So the hospital generators pre-calculated benefits is one of the newer guidances issued by FEMA. For everybody's sake, this will be our first cycle as 4480 to use it, implement it, and work it through. All you have to know for pre-calculated benefits, at least so far, is that when we know that your project does qualify for a pre-calculated benefit, it removes the need for a traditional BCA, meaning one done by the toolkit and the Excel file. When we document, as we need to, all the information, and we write our own cover letter to say that you met pre-calculated benefits requirement, it removes the BCA need, but it doesn't take away the application need. So you still have to do the application, submit all the other supporting information, but at least it takes a BCA requirement and converts it to pre-calculated benefits. And then we'll say that your project is cost effective for X reasons, and that you fit the hospital generator guidance. Now, the key I can tell you up front, the pre-calculated benefit requires hospitals with emergency rooms on site. That's the first evaluation you'll need, and the guidance, if you do need it, let us know. We can share a copy. FEMA does have it posted online, but there's a certain set of requirements. It also changes based if you're rural or urban, which has another definition and a website mapper you can use. But you have to work through all that paperwork to say that, yes, we can meet this or we cannot. But we as a team, both myself, Prab, and all the other BCA specialists in-house will look at your data and make sure if you fit that requirement or not for pre-calculated benefits. If you do not meet pre-calculated benefits, then we will let you know, and you must work in the traditional BCA. But we'll let you know as soon as we have all your information.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. Another question has come through. If a generator replaces one that has exceeded its useful life, but there are no historic damage documentation, would we use professional expectations, or how would they approach this?
So one thing I can say about that is, I mean, the whole point of the BCA toolkit is to ensure that if the project's being cost effective, it's mitigating damages that would be there if this project wasn't happening. So if there aren't any damages already, then yeah, I mean, historical damages would be very difficult to do that. You can try professional expected damages. You would need to have a professional provide a professional opinion based on his technical studies of that area and any power loss in that area. Anything else you'd like to add to that, Mark, about that question?
Yeah, I agree with Prab. Team, for the BCA in general, it's always about damages that were literally usually incurred, which is why we always lean towards historical damages. Professional expected are, yeah, if the damages could occur, what would they be? But right, it comes from a licensed professional and at the level of a study. So you'd have to have, a full detailed report based on scientific data to say, what are the causes of power loss. It takes on recurrence interval information. It talks about impact, and obviously cites all its sources. Whether it be NOAA and other major scientific agencies to really back that up. Or again, if these are vendors in the generator industry for long term and they're using their professional opinions, that's fine. But again, we want to make sure this is well documented and they argue all their points on a physical basis, meaning this could happen. These are the vulnerabilities. If it's more, this could happen in general. Well, yeah, but we need to know, is it vulnerable to wind? Is it vulnerable to flood? A combination of both. And it has to really detail for all of us what's actually happening, because it unfortunately has not happened on site. So it's very much a theoretical, viewpoint, but it's acceptable as long as it's documented. And we'll again review it and
Yep, great. Thank you, Mark. We have just about 9 minutes or so left in our time frame here. I do also want to reiterate that generators are typically for those critical facilities. So if you're not sure what your critical facility is in regard to those generators, again, take a look at that hazard mitigation plan. Typically those critical facilities are, it's performing a critical function within your community. Cooling shelters, warming shelters, that type of thing can fall under that critical infrastructure, or critical facility rather. There have been multiple questions regarding applications. So we encourage you, if you're able to do one application, if you're looking to do, multiple sites with generators, we do encourage you to put all of that onto one application, bearing in mind, if you have multiple generators in one application, you still also have to make sure that they are cost effective. So sometimes it is more cost effective to separate them. So that's something, sometimes we have to play around a little bit, both on the BCA side to see which is better for the cost effectiveness aspect of that. But definitely, we encourage you. We don't want you to do more work than you have to. If you're looking to do, 2 or more generators, if you're able to put that on one application and complete one benefit cost analysis and it shows that it's cost effective, we strongly encourage that. If you have to separate it to meet that benefit cost analysis, we'll work with you on that one as well. Let's see. We have one question that came in. How do you calculate the expected damages after mitigation for a culvert roadway project? I would assume this is, if you are mitigating to a 100-year flood, your anticipated damages would be what a 50-year flood would do. Is that correct, Mark?
Yes. So, but to add to Beth's point, there's one methodology that can be used if you're unsure of your initial expected damages, which is this. If you know your level of protection, right, after mitigation, which is known as the design level of protection. So if your culvert will work towards a 100-year storm, in the toolkit, your damage after mitigation will have a 100-year recurrence interval. Now, the damages after would be equal to the damages before. So if you have 2 events worth of damages, say $10,000 and $40,000, you would take that sum, $50,000, and place it in the after mitigation column. The logic on that is if the project were to completely fail, only theoretically, just saying that it can be exceeded, the only time you don't have residual risk is an acquisition, then you would take in all the damages from before mitigation. We're not obviously, we don't wish bad on your project, but for the calculation's sake, you're only stating that there's residual risk present, because culverts, flood walls, even generators have residual risk. They're not perfect. There will always be a storm level that is expected to cause some damages. Obviously, the mitigation reduces it, but is not absolutely perfect. So, you know, just make sure that you know for all project types, apart from acquisition, there will always be a damage after mitigation, not only number, but a recurrence interval to consider. For everybody that's working with design teams, for what I know, you will probably have this defined for you. It's a level of protection. Those that are working independently, we will look through your data and try to best define it, or at least try to understand what you have so far in the application to make sure we can accurately confirm it.
Great, thank you, Mark. Alicia, would you be able to unmute Christine O'Prey, please? She has her hand raised and has a question. Christine, you are live. Christine, are you there? Oh, yes, maybe we answered her question already. Let's go back into the Q&A.
Hello?
Hi, Christine.
Yep.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry. I
That's
kept trying to
okay.
unmute, but it wasn't working. So I have questions about, I guess, my other previous questions. If you don't know when the dam was built, but you know when the road was built on top of it, would you accept that as the date?
You want to take
That's
this?
a great point, Christine. I would say that if they're relatively, if you know them to be the same date by some other internal reference, right?
I don't know them to
Then
be
you
the
could
same
say the
date.
dam and road were established on the same date or within 5 years of each other.
I wouldn't say
We
I
So,
can
would know
accept
so
that.
she's
that.
not sure. What she's saying is they only know the date of the road, not
Oh, date of the
necessarily the
road.
date of the bridge.
The dam was built by someone else.
Yeah, dam, sorry.
Previous to the county obtaining the property. And I don't know when it was built, and the entity that built it is long since gone. So that would give you that the dam is at least 50 years old. If the county built a road on top of it and now is responsible for both the road and the dam, would you accept since there is no way to determine the date of the dam, would you accept the date of the road as the date of the structure?
Okay, I would venture to yes, as long as all that is being captured in some letter that we'll eventually receive, right? Just saying that the original data for the dam is unavailable due to loss of records and the agency no longer being available, literally. And again, now the road and dam structures are incorporated, and now we use the roads year built going forward, and that's fine as long as that all that is captured, you know, from the back end. Like, because again, we want to avoid the question is, can you get the dams year built? No, it's literally not possible now because of all the data loss, unfortunately, you know, at this time. So we just want to say that yes, we use the road in lieu of the dam year built.
Great, thanks, Mark. That's some great advice.
Okay,
We have
so
one. Oh, sorry, Christine, go ahead.
The next question about calculating damages with your own crew. I thought that FEMA didn't let us count damages if we did the work during regular business hours, or does that only count for a different type of FEMA thing? Is not with hazard mitigation?
Oh, I've never heard that FEMA didn't. If you're out there working and repairing something that has been damaged, I have never heard FEMA come back and say you can't use that. Mark,
Okay,
have you heard that?
But this is Mark. I can't say I have. I know that when we do reimbursements, at least for ourselves, we specify that as force account labor, because that's on,
Right.
you know, that's using teams on the ground to, you know, as basically expenditures again for the repair. But I think they're trying to say is like, what is normal operation versus what is a emergency task. That seems to come from the other side, maybe the public assistance view, but I can't speak on that specifically.
Yeah. I mean, that would make sense. You know, if this is just a normal day-to-day routine work that they do, I can understand why they would say you wouldn't be able to do that. But if it's something that you're going out to, you know, constantly repair or fix or take care of a situation, you know, utilizing the community's equipment during an event or something like that, even if it is during normal business hours, if you are responding to a situation, I've never seen that or heard that be an issue, but that's definitely something that we can, you know, reach out and get some follow-up on.
And what if you don't have a traffic count for when you close the road? It's a small local road.
Right.
You could
So
definitely come up with a diversion plan, but you don't know how many people actually travel the road.
right. Mark, there are, you know, traffic counts that like formulas you can use.
Right, and the best point, there's some DOT online GIS tools that if you know at least a lat long for your local road, it can give you what is known as the my apologies, team, AADT count, which is the average annual daily traffic count. The problem is with the GIS tool, it may not count every road. I'll be very honest, tools are limited. They are just developed by our New York State DOT counterparts, but it's at least a start point. If you use the online DOT tool and you're saying, well, I can't find this data, we can look that data for you, but just know that we normally like the on-the-ground counts because it tends to be more accurate. The GIS layers are literally updated as databases, so it may not be as current as we want it to be. So we always tend to ask everybody applying, give us your data, please. If not, we'll use DOT to fill in the gap. But we ask that you at least take an initial attempt for the DOT layers. If not, we'll send you the link. And then hopefully it has it for that local road. If not, we'll try to find some alternate to give that data.
Great, thanks, Mark. And definitely, we have one more question, but if anybody has any additional questions, just, you know, in essence of time, feel free to shoot them over to the HMGP 4480 at dhses.ny.gov email. We manage that, we maintain that, and, you know, any questions that you think of, you know, even if you don't have one quite yet, shoot those over. We can get that answer to you. I know, Mark, you do have something to get to, but we have one quick question that I would like to bring up before we end the webinar. It's, if a road has not been washed out before, but it is continuously eroding with every flood and getting closer to the road every time, what level of detail is needed in a report for that to show the need for that?
Okay, so for my first read, if the thing is erosion, it's going to be, it looks like it probably ties to stabilization project. So any data or study based on the local rate of erosion and, again, for future impacts that could be expected, like, again, the professional expected damages argument, where a scientific study would say what could happen in future events if the erosion were not controlled, would be helpful. If these studies are published already, I would say look through the literature. If one has to be done, you know, you can indicate that in your application, but that is normally very specialized data that has to be, you know, published for each and every site, because countywide FEMA does publish erosion studies, but it views the whole coastline. Obviously, you want to make it specific to your area and project, so that's why you have to have usually erosion studies published for your specific area, down to, and I mean at the street level or any crossway in the water body that, you know, may affect your culvert, may affect the roadway, and we have to know it to that level specifically. So keep that in mind. If you feel that that data is not available, just let us know in the application, and we'll, again, look for other resources that may have this.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And everybody that is still on the webinar, thank you for hanging in there with us. We've had some great questions and great answers. Again, these slides, you know, will be available. We're going to try to get them out to everybody this afternoon that was on the webinar. So you're able to utilize this as that desk reference. It's also being recorded. That'll be up on our website. We don't have necessarily a time that we can give you when that's going to be up there, but you know, previous webinars are up there, previous slide decks are up there. And as always, if you ever think of any questions, you know, sometimes, you know, middle of the night, you think of something wonky that comes out, send us those emails, send us those questions. You know, we have a project outreach team. I'm sure many of you have spoken to. You know, you have Prabai and, you know, our teammate Andrea too, standing by to answer any of those application questions. Again, thank you so much for sharing the past hour or so with us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Prab and Mark and Alicia as well for your work on this webinar.